If you look at Canada, it would be cherished as a 51st state. They don't pay their share of military in NATO. They pay very little for military. They're not protected at all. And the reason is they think we're going to protect them. The other thing is we subsidize them to the tune of about $200 billion a year. If we stop doing that, if we stop allowing them to make cars through tariffs and other things, cars, trucks, etc., what they make, they're not viable as a country.
What if I told you that Canada, the second largest country in the world, a nation known for its wealth, safety, and global influence, might not survive without the United States? Sounds shocking, right? But that's exactly what Donald Trump is claiming. In his latest speech, he suggested that Canada is only afloat because of American trade, military protection, and economic support. And if the U.S. pulled the plug, well, Canada would be in serious trouble. But is this claim rooted in fact, or is it just political grandstanding? Could Canada truly stand on its own without America's safety net? Or is this a story much deeper than what meets the eye? Today, we uncover the hidden relationship between Canada and the U.S., one built on power, money, and a delicate balance of survival. We'll explore the shocking economic ties, the military realities, and the unspoken risks Canada faces if the U.S. decides to walk away. Stay with us, because what you're about to learn might just change the way you see Canada forever. The economic reality. Let's start with the economy. Canada and the U.S. have one of the largest trading relationships in the world, with over 3.6 billion in goods crossing the border every single day. That's a massive number. But does this mean Canada needs the U.S. to survive? Not exactly. Canada is one of the world's top 10 largest economies, with strong trade ties to Europe, Asia, and other global markets. The country has vast natural resources, a highly skilled workforce, and a banking system that is consistently ranked among the most stable in the world. However, a huge percentage of Canada's exports, about 75%, go directly to the U.S. That's a heavy dependence. If the U.S. were to impose tariffs, restrict trade agreements, or face an economic downturn, Canada would feel the impact almost instantly. Could Canada shift away from relying so heavily on the U.S.? In theory, yes, but in reality, it's complicated. Canada has made moves to diversify its trade, signing agreements like the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with the European Union, and strengthening ties with countries like China, Japan, and South Korea. But transitioning away from U.S. reliance would take decades. And trade isn't just about raw numbers. It's about supply chains, industries, and jobs. Take the auto industry, for example. Many Canadian-built cars rely on American-made parts and vice versa. If the U.S.-Canada trade relationship were severely disrupted, thousands of jobs in both countries would be at risk. So, is Canada too dependent on the U.S.? Should it reduce its reliance? Or is this economic partnership simply too big to fail? What do you think? Military and defense. Is Canada too dependent? Donald Trump made another bold claim. He says Canada assumes the U.S. will protect them and doesn't contribute enough to its own defense. So is Canada really relying on the U.S. for security? Let's break it down. It's true Canada spends significantly less on defense than the United States. Right now, Canada's military budget is around 1.38% of its GDP, falling short of NATO's recommended 2% target. In contrast, the U.S. spends over 3.5% of its GDP on defense, which is more than 10 times what Canada allocates. This raises a key question. Is Canada a free rider in NATO, relying on U.S. protection without pulling its weight? That's a concern Washington has raised for years. However, while Canada may not spend as much, it does maintain a modern professional military. It actively participates in NATO missions, UN peacekeeping operations, and joint military exercises with the U.S., particularly through NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. NORAD is a binational agreement, meaning Canada does contribute to continental security, even if the U.S. takes on the larger role. Beyond NATO, Canada also has strong military partnerships with the UK, Australia, and other allies. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which includes Canada, plays a crucial role in global security and surveillance. So while Canada may not have the sheer military strength of the U.S., it isn't defenseless either. The real question is, should Canada increase its defense spending, or is it better off maintaining its current strategy? And if the U.S. were to step back from protecting Canada, What would that mean for the country's security? What do you think? Should Canada pay more for its own defense, or is the current system working just fine? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Could Canada survive without the U.S.? Here's the big question. If the U.S. suddenly cut off trade and security agreements, what would happen to Canada? Economic shock, a heavy blow, but not a knockout. There's no doubt that losing access to the U.S. market would hit Canada hard. Right now, about 75% of Canada's exports go directly to the United States, a level of dependence far higher than what the U.S. has on Canada. Canada's economy is deeply tied to American industries, especially in auto manufacturing, agriculture, and technology. If the U.S. suddenly cut trade ties, Canadian businesses would face massive disruptions, job losses, and economic instability, at least a resource powerhouse. But here's the thing. Canada isn't some fragile economy that would collapse overnight. In fact, Canada is one of the world's top 10 economies, with vast natural resources, a strong banking system, and trade agreements with over 50 countries. Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world and has enormous reserves of minerals, timber, and agricultural goods. With the right trade policies, it could diversify exports to Europe, China, and India, reducing its reliance on the U.S. Trade alternatives. Could Canada pivot? In fact, Canada is already working to expand its global trade network. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, gives Canada access to fast-growing economies in Asia and Latin America. Meanwhile, its agreement with the European Union, CETA, provides duty-free trade to one of the world's largest markets. However, replacing the U.S. as a trade partner wouldn't be easy. American businesses and consumers buy more from Canada than any other country. Finding new buyers for everything from cars to lumber to wheat would take years of restructuring. Military and security, a major weak spot. Trade isn't the only concern. Canada has long depended on NORAD and the U.S. military umbrella for defense, particularly in Arctic security and air defense. If the U.S. withdrew, Canada would have to significantly boost military spending to defend itself against potential threats. That means billions more in defense spending, expanded military recruitment, and new alliances with countries like the UK, France, and Australia. So, could Canada survive without the U.S.? The answer is yes, but it wouldn't be easy. The economy would suffer in the short term, but over time, Canada could rebuild its trade networks, strengthen military independence, and reduce its reliance on American industries. But here's something to consider. Would the U.S. survive without Canada? The answer might surprise you. Could the U.S. survive without Canada? While much of the debate focuses on whether Canada can survive without the U.S., let's flip the question. Could the U.S. function without Canada? Many Americans don't realize just how intertwined the two economies are. Canada is not just a neighbor, it's the United States' largest trading partner in many sectors. Cutting off trade with Canada wouldn't just hurt Canada, it would create major disruptions for the U.S. as well. Energy, the lifeline of the U.S. economy. Let's start with energy. The U.S. heavily depends on Canada for oil, natural gas, and electricity. In fact, Canada is the largest foreign supplier of energy to the U.S., providing nearly 4 million barrels of crude oil per day, more than any other country, including Saudi Arabia. Without Canadian oil, U.S. refineries would struggle to replace supply, leading to higher gas prices, energy shortages, and economic slowdowns. American consumers and businesses would feel the impact almost immediately. And it's not just oil. Canada also supplies nearly 10% of the U.S.'s electricity. Several U.S. states, like New York and Minnesota, rely on Canadian hydroelectric power to keep the lights on. A sudden trade cutoff would mean higher energy costs for millions of Americans. Trade and manufacturing, a two-way dependence. Beyond energy, Canada plays a key role in U.S. manufacturing and supply chains. American companies rely on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automotive parts to build everything from cars to airplanes. Detroit, the heart of the American auto industry, sources nearly half of its vehicle components from Canadian manufacturers. A trade disruption would mean delayed production, job losses, and skyrocketing vehicle prices. Security and defense, a forgotten dependence. And then there's national security. Canada and the U.S. share one of the world's longest undefended borders. Through agreements like NORAD, the two nations work together to monitor airspace, prevent terrorist threats, and secure the Arctic region. If this partnership ended, the USF would have to take on full responsibility for northern security, adding billions in defense costs. The verdict: a two-way street. So while Trump's statement suggests that Canada can't survive without the U.S., the truth is it's a two-way street. The U.S. relies on Canadian energy, trade, and security partnerships just as much as Canada relies on the U.S. If either country were to sever ties, both economies would take major hits, and everyday citizens would feel the consequences. So the question isn't just whether Canada could survive without the U.S., but whether the U.S. could truly function without Canada. What do you think? Are the two countries too dependent on each other? Let us know in the comments. The 51st state debate: could Canada ever join the U.S.? Donald Trump has made some bold claims, but one of the most shocking? The idea that Canada would be better off as the 51st state of the United States. At first, it might sound like an interesting proposal. After all, Canada and the U.S. share the longest undefended border in the world, speak the same language, and have deep economic ties. But here's the real question: would Canadians ever agree to this? The Canadian perspective: a resounding no. The answer from most Canadians: a clear and overwhelming no. In fact, polls consistently show that a vast majority of Canadians strongly oppose the idea of becoming part of the United States. Why? Because Canada's national identity is deeply tied to being separate from the United States. Canadians take pride in their universal health care, stronger social safety nets, and cultural distinctiveness, things that would be at risk if Canada merged with the U.S. Canada has a parliamentary democracy, gun control policies, and a strong emphasis on multiculturalism, all areas where it differs significantly from its southern neighbor. For many Canadians, joining the U.S. wouldn't just be a political shift, it would mean losing their identity. What about pro-merger supporters? Of course, not everyone is opposed. A small percentage of Canadians, particularly those who support closer economic ties, believe that merging with the U.S. could bring benefits, such as a stronger economy, access to larger markets, and a greater global influence. However, even among those in favor of closer ties, full annexation is seen as highly unlikely. A borderless North America? Not so fast. This isn't the first time the idea of a borderless North America has been discussed. Over the years, some American politicians have floated the idea of deeper integration, but the reality is that both countries value their sovereignty too much for this to happen. So while Trump might see Canada as a natural extension of the U.S., most Canadians see that idea as unrealistic, unnecessary, and even insulting to their national identity. The bottom line: Canada is not the 51st state, and it never will be. Deeply connected relationship. They may have differences in politics, economy, and culture, but one thing is clear: Canada is not simply dependent on the U.S. It is a global player in its own right. Both nations benefit from their partnership. The U.S. gains a reliable energy supplier, a strong trading ally, and a committed defense partner. Meanwhile, Canada enjoys economic advantages and security collaboration, but it's not helpless without the U.S. So while political statements may stir controversy, the truth is that the bond between Canada and the U.S. remains strong, built on mutual interests rather than dependence. What do you think? Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Canada is too dependent on the U.S., or is this just political rhetoric? Could Canada thrive on its own, or would the U.S. struggle without its northern neighbor? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive,